At a glittering Manhattan anniversary gala, Daniel Brooks wraps an arm around his glamorous fiancée when she nods toward a quiet woman by the champagne table. "Do you know her?" she asks. Daniel barely glances over. No, the woman hears him. Emily Carter, his ex-wife. The room buzzes as the lights dim, and a lawyer steps on stage to honor the late billionaire Arthur Whitmore. "Tonight," he announces, "we reveal the sole heir to Whitmore Global." Guests lean forward. Daniel sips his drink, bored, until the lawyer says the name slowly. Emily Carter. Glass slips from Daniel's hand, and Emily finally steps into the light. "Some people don't break your heart," the voice inside Emily Carter whispered as she stepped beneath the towering crystal chandeliers. "They simply pretend you never existed." The ballroom of the Whitmore Global Anniversary Gala shimmered in warm gold light, the kind that reflected off polished marble floors and rows of champagne glasses balanced on silver trays. And the air carried the soft scent of expensive perfume and old money as conversations hummed like distant music. Emily stood near the edge of the room, fingers lightly wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute she had barely touched, the cool glass trembling almost imperceptibly in her hand as she watched the crowd swirl in elegant circles beneath the chandeliers. It had been 3 years since she last stepped into a room like this. 3 years since the life she once lived had been quietly erased. Across the ballroom, near the grand staircase framed by white roses and velvet drapes, Daniel Brooks stood surrounded by admirers, his tailored navy suit fitting him perfectly as cameras flashed from a local society blog documenting the event. On his arm was Vanessa Hale, a rising social media personality whose diamond bracelet caught the light every time she laughed. Emily saw Daniel before he saw her. For a moment, something old and fragile tightened in her chest, a memory she thought she had carefully folded away. 10 years of marriage had once placed her exactly where Vanessa stood now, at Daniel's side, smiling for the cameras, introduced as the woman who helped build his success. But tonight, Emily Carter was simply another quiet guest standing alone at the edge of the room. Daniel's eyes drifted across the crowd casually, scanning faces with the practiced confidence of a man used to being admired. Then his gaze paused. It landed directly on Emily. Time slowed for a fraction of a second. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed from a nearby table. But between them there was a stillness that felt almost physical. Vanessa followed his line of sight, tilting her head slightly. "Do you know her?" she asked, her voice light with curiosity. Daniel didn't hesitate. His eyes flicked over Emily once more, colder now, as if assessing a stranger on a subway platform. Then he shrugged. "No," he said. The word was simple, casual, effortless, and Emily heard it clearly from across the room. For a moment, the weight of it pressed against her ribs, not like pain, but like the echo of something long finished. She lowered her gaze to the champagne glass in her hand, watching tiny bubbles rise slowly to the surface as the ballroom lights shimmered through the pale gold liquid. Around her, whispers moved through the crowd as more guests arrived, tuxedos and evening gowns brushing against velvet curtains and marble columns. No one noticed the quiet woman standing near the bar. No one recognized the name Emily Carter anymore. And perhaps that was exactly how Daniel wanted it. The orchestra shifted to a slower melody as the lights dimmed slightly near the stage at the front of the ballroom. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped onto the platform beside a large screen displaying the silver crest of Whitmore Global. Conversations softened as guests turned toward the stage. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the legacy of the late Arthur Whitmore." Emily slowly lifted her eyes toward the stage, the faintest hint of something unreadable passing across her expression as the lawyer continued. "Tonight," he added, pausing long enough to capture every ounce of attention in the room, "we will also introduce the future of Whitmore Global." Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks reached for a fresh glass of champagne, completely unaware that the quiet woman he had just dismissed was about to become the most important person in the room. The lawyer's voice continued to echo gently across the grand ballroom as the enormous screen behind him shifted to a photograph of Arthur Whitmore standing beside the Manhattan skyline, his silver hair catching the evening sun and a quiet ripple of respect passed through the audience because in New York, everyone knew the name Whitmore. Emily Carter did not move from her place near the champagne table, yet the faint glow of the chandeliers reflected in her eyes as memories stirred with the quiet persistence of old music. 3 years earlier, before the silence, before the divorce, before Daniel Brooks decided that ambition mattered more than loyalty, Emily had been sitting in a very different room. It had been a modest office on the 32nd floor of Whitmore Global Headquarters overlooking the Hudson River, where sunlight spilled across polished oak floors and the hum of the city drifted faintly through the glass. Emily had arrived that morning carrying a thin leather portfolio and a nervous determination that she carefully hid behind calm professionalism. At the time she was working as a financial analyst, a position she had built through long nights, meticulous spreadsheets, and the quiet refusal to be underestimated. The meeting had not been meant to be important. It was simply a consulting appointment requested by Arthur Whitmore himself. The man was already a legend in American finance, the founder of Whitmore Global, a company that had quietly built power across energy, logistics, and technology for more than 4 decades. When Arthur Whitmore entered the room that morning, he had not looked like the kind of billionaire the newspapers loved to describe. He wore a simple gray suit, no extravagant watch, no entourage, just a calm presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. Emily remembered how he studied her presentation in silence, the steady ticking of a wall clock measuring each second as she explained the inefficiencies she had discovered inside one of the company's investment branches. Most analysts would have softened the truth for a man like Whitmore. Emily did not. She showed him exactly where the money was leaking and exactly how it could be fixed. When she finished, she expected criticism. Instead, Arthur Whitmore leaned back in his chair and smiled in a quiet, thoughtful way. "You are the first person in months who did not try to impress me," he had said. "You tried to help the company." That conversation became another meeting, and then another. Slowly, Emily began working more closely with Whitmore Global, reviewing strategies, identifying problems no one else wanted to acknowledge. Arthur Whitmore valued one thing above everything else in business: honesty. In Emily, he found it without decoration. Over time, their professional relationship became something deeper, something built not on status, but trust. While Daniel Brooks spent his evenings chasing networking events and expensive dinners, Emily often stayed late at Whitmore headquarters reviewing financial reports beside Arthur Whitmore's quiet office, the city lights flickering like constellations beyond the windows. He asked about her ideas, her perspective, her future. He listened carefully, something Daniel had gradually stopped doing long before their marriage ended. In those quiet hours, Emily realized something about Arthur Whitmore that the world rarely understood. The man had built an empire, but he had very few people he truly trusted. One evening, nearly a year before his passing, Whitmore stood beside the glass wall overlooking the Hudson River as winter snow drifted across the dark water. Without turning around, he asked Emily a simple question. "If you had the responsibility of protecting this company for the next 50 years, what would you do differently?" Emily answered honestly, the same way she always had. She explained what needed to change, what risks had been ignored, what future Whitmore Global could become if someone had the courage to guide it carefully. Arthur Whitmore listened in silence, his reflection faint in the glass. When she finished, he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a thought that had been forming for a long time. "Good," he said quietly, "because someone will have to." Back in the ballroom, the lawyer on stage paused while the image of Arthur Whitmore faded from the screen, replaced by the silver crest of Whitmore Global. Around the room, guests leaned forward with anticipation, whispering to one another about which executive or family member might inherit the enormous responsibility of the company's future. At the edge of the crowd, Daniel Brooks lifted his champagne glass with mild interest, unaware that the quiet woman he had just denied knowing had once been the person Arthur Whitmore trusted more than anyone in that entire room. The lawyer allowed the quiet anticipation in the ballroom to build for several long seconds, the kind of pause that made every whisper fade and every pair of eyes turn toward the stage, and beneath the golden light of the chandeliers the massive screen behind him displayed the silver crest of Whitmore Global like a quiet promise of power. Emily Carter remained still beside the champagne table, the delicate stem of her glass resting lightly between her fingers as she listened, her expression calm in a way that had taken years to learn. Across the room, Daniel Brooks leaned casually against the marble bar, his attention drifting between the stage and the circle of investors surrounding him. Vanessa Hale adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and glanced toward the stage with polite curiosity, unaware that the night was slowly shifting beneath her feet. The lawyer cleared his throat again and placed both hands on the podium, his voice steady as he continued. He spoke about Arthur Whitmore's decades of leadership, about the quiet discipline that built Whitmore Global from a modest logistics company into one of the most influential investment groups in the United States. Guests nodded with respectful interest. Many of them had spent years trying to earn the approval of the man whose portrait still appeared on the screen behind the stage. The lawyer described Whitmore's final months with careful words, explaining how the billionaire had spent his remaining time reviewing the company's future and ensuring that his life's work would remain protected long after his passing. A soft murmur moved through the crowd as people speculated quietly about which executive or distant relative might inherit that responsibility. Daniel Brooks lifted his champagne glass again, watching the stage with mild interest as if the announcement were nothing more than another predictable corporate ceremony. In his mind, the possibilities were obvious. Perhaps the board would appoint a senior partner or a trusted director from Whitmore's inner circle. The name would be someone powerful, someone familiar to the financial world. The lawyer finally opened a thin leather folder resting on the podium, the faint sound of paper echoing through the quiet ballroom. In accordance with the final instructions of Arthur Whitmore, he said slowly, the controlling ownership of Whitmore Global will pass to the individual he personally selected to guide the company into its next chapter. A ripple of curiosity spread through the room. Cameras lifted slightly as reporters from several financial magazines leaned forward, ready to record the moment. Daniel Brooks took another sip of champagne, completely relaxed, his mind already drifting to the networking opportunities that would follow the announcement. On the far side of the ballroom, Emily Carter finally lifted her eyes toward the stage. The lawyer looked up from the document in his hands, scanning the audience with calm precision before speaking again. Arthur Whitmore believed that trust could not be inherited, he continued. It had to be earned. The room grew still. Even the orchestra near the balcony lowered their instruments, waiting. For that reason, the lawyer said, Mr. Whitmore appointed a single heir to the Whitmore Global Holdings. A long pause followed, stretching across the silent ballroom. The lawyer then spoke the name clearly into the microphone. Emily Carter. For 1 second the words seemed to hang in the air without meaning. Then Daniel Brooks felt the champagne glass slip slightly in his hand as his eyes snapped across the room toward the quiet woman standing near the bar. Vanessa followed his gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Around them, dozens of guests slowly turned their heads in the same direction. Emily Carter set her champagne glass gently on the table beside her and stepped forward, the soft echo of her heels crossing the marble floor as the entire room watched in stunned silence. The quiet echo of Emily Carter's footsteps across the marble floor seemed louder than the orchestra that had just fallen silent. And for a moment the grand ballroom of Whitmore Global felt smaller than it had only seconds earlier, as if the entire space had folded inward around a single unfolding moment. Dozens of conversations that had filled the room just minutes ago disappeared into a stunned hush as guests watched the woman Daniel Brooks had dismissed step calmly toward the stage. Emily did not rush. She moved with a measured pace, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that suggested this moment had been anticipated long before anyone else in the room realized it was coming. The chandeliers overhead reflected in the polished marble floor beneath her heels, creating a shimmering path of light that followed her toward the podium where the lawyer waited. Daniel Brooks remained frozen near the bar, the champagne glass still balanced in his hand though he had forgotten to drink from it. The name still echoed in his mind with a quiet disbelief that refused to settle. Emily Carter. For years he had spoken that name only in the past tense, as if it belonged to a chapter of his life that had closed and disappeared. Yet here she was, crossing the ballroom as every eye followed her. Vanessa Hale turned slowly toward him, confusion creasing her expression. "That is your ex-wife?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the clink of glassware nearby. Daniel did not answer immediately. His gaze remained locked on Emily as she approached the stage, And for the first time that evening his confident composure began to slip in small, almost invisible ways. Around them, guests leaned toward one another with growing curiosity. Some recognized Emily now, remembering faint stories from years earlier when Daniel Brooks had first begun rising in New York's financial circles. Others simply watched with fascination, sensing the shift in power that had quietly taken place in the room. On the stage, the lawyer stepped aside slightly as Emily reached the final step leading to the platform. He offered a respectful nod, the kind reserved for someone whose authority had already been formally established. Emily returned the gesture politely before turning to face the audience. For a moment, she simply stood there, the golden light of the chandeliers illuminating the calm determination in her eyes as she looked out over the sea of unfamiliar and familiar faces. The massive screen behind her still displayed the silver crest of Whitmore Global, a symbol that had once belonged to Arthur Whitmore alone. Now the weight of that legacy had shifted. Daniel Brooks slowly set his champagne glass down on the marble counter beside him, his attention no longer divided by conversation or social obligation. He watched Emily with a focus he had not given her in years. 1,000 small memories flickered through his mind in quick succession, fragments of conversations, quiet dinners, late nights when she had worked silently at the kitchen table while he planned his next career move. He had believed those moments were ordinary, replaceable. The lawyer adjusted the microphone and spoke again with calm clarity. Ms. Carter has worked closely with Mr. Whitmore for several years, he explained to the audience. During that time, she earned his full confidence in the management of Whitmore Global. A wave of surprise moved through the crowd as this information settled into place. Some guests exchanged impressed glances. Others looked toward Emily with a new kind of curiosity that bordered on respect. Emily finally stepped closer to the microphone, her hands resting lightly on the podium as she looked across the ballroom one more time. For a brief moment her eyes passed over Daniel Brooks, standing near the bar. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only a quiet recognition of how far the distance between them had grown. Then she turned her attention back to the room. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. Arthur Whitmore believed that leadership was not about power, she said calmly. It was about responsibility. And in that moment, every person in the room understood that the woman Daniel Brooks once claimed he did not know now held the future of Whitmore Global in her hands. For several seconds after Emily Carter finished speaking, the ballroom remained perfectly still, as if the entire room needed time to understand what had just happened. The golden light from the chandeliers shimmered across the marble floor, while the silver crest of Whitmore Global glowed behind her on the massive screen. Emily stood calmly at the podium, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood, the quiet confidence in her posture carrying more weight than any dramatic announcement could have. She had not raised her voice, she had not tried to impress the room, yet every person present could feel the shift that had taken place. Near the bar, Daniel Brooks felt an unfamiliar tightness settle in his chest as the silence stretched around him. Only minutes earlier he had looked across the ballroom and dismissed Emily Carter with a single careless word. Now the same woman stood at the center of the most powerful company in the room. Vanessa Hale slowly folded her arms, her eyes moving from the stage back to Daniel as realization began to form behind her polite smile. "You never mentioned that your ex-wife worked with Arthur Whitmore," she said quietly. Daniel did not answer right away. His attention remained fixed on Emily as she stepped away from the microphone and exchanged a few quiet words with the lawyer beside her. For the first time that evening, Daniel noticed the subtle details he had ignored before. The calm certainty in her movements. The way senior executives near the stage greeted her with respectful nods. The fact that none of this appeared to surprise her. Across the ballroom, conversations began to return in low murmurs as guests absorbed the significance of the announcement. Some of the investors who had been speaking with Daniel only moments earlier were now watching Emily with clear interest, whispering to one another as they recognized the future influence she now carried. The orchestra resumed a soft melody from the balcony, but the tone of the room had changed. This was no longer simply a celebration of Whitmore Global's past. It had become the introduction of its future. Emily stepped down from the stage and moved calmly through the crowd, acknowledging greetings from several members of the company board. Her composure remained steady, Yet there was a quiet warmth in the way she spoke to each person, the kind of presence that did not demand attention, yet naturally earned it. As she walked further into the ballroom, the distance between her and Daniel slowly disappeared. Guests parted slightly as she approached, their curiosity almost tangible in the air. Daniel straightened instinctively, the old habit of confidence returning to his posture, even though he could feel the balance of the evening shifting in ways he had not expected. For a moment neither of them spoke. Emily paused only a few feet away, her gaze meeting his with the calm clarity of someone who had long ago stopped waiting for approval. Daniel finally cleared his throat, searching for the kind of casual tone he used in business meetings. "Emily," he said, as if the name had only just returned to his memory. "I did not realize you were involved with Whitmore Global." Emily studied him quietly for a brief moment, the faintest hint of understanding in her expression. Not anger, not triumph, just the quiet recognition of how time had changed them both. The music from the balcony drifted softly through the air as she answered in the same calm voice she had used on stage. "There are many things people do not realize until the moment arrives," she said gently. And in the subtle shift of power that followed, Daniel Brooks began to understand that the woman he once ignored had quietly built a future far larger than the life he believed she had left behind. The quiet words Emily Carter spoke seemed to linger in the air long after she finished, and for a moment Daniel Brooks found himself searching her face as if he were trying to recognize someone he once knew but had somehow forgotten. The orchestra continued, its gentle melody above them, while conversation slowly returned across the ballroom. Yet the small circle of space between Emily and Daniel remained strangely still. Vanessa Hale shifted slightly beside him, her polished smile returning as she studied Emily with the careful curiosity of someone measuring a new social dynamic. The guests nearest to them pretended to focus on their drinks or their conversations, but their attention drifted back again and again toward the unexpected reunion unfolding only a few feet away. Daniel forced a small laugh, the kind he used in tense business negotiations when he wanted to regain control of the moment. "Well," he said, straightening the cuff of his jacket, "that explains the surprise tonight." Emily regarded him quietly. The same man who had once filled their apartment with plans and confident predictions now stood before her looking slightly uncertain, as if the world had quietly shifted beneath his feet. For years Daniel had believed success belonged to the people who claimed it first, the people who spoke the loudest in rooms like this one. Emily had never competed in that way. Instead, she had listened, studied, and worked quietly in spaces most people overlooked. Vanessa tilted her head slightly and offered her hand with polished courtesy. "Vanessa Hale," she said smoothly. "Daniel has told me a little about you." Emily shook her hand gently. "Emily Carter," she replied with the same calm tone she had used on stage. The brief exchange was polite, almost friendly, yet the subtle tension beneath it was impossible to miss. Around them, more members of the Whitmore board began approaching to congratulate Emily. A tall man in a charcoal suit who had been speaking with the lawyer earlier now stepped forward with a respectful nod. "Miss Carter," he said, "Arthur would have been very proud of tonight." Emily returned the nod with quiet gratitude. "He trusted the people in this company to protect what he built," she said. "That trust will continue." The executive smiled approvingly before moving aside to allow others to greet her. Daniel watched each interaction with growing attention. The respect these people showed Emily was not the polite acknowledgement given to a symbolic air. It was the genuine recognition reserved for someone who had already earned authority long before the public announcement. Daniel remembered the evenings years ago when Emily would sit at the kitchen table reviewing financial reports while he prepared presentations for investors. At the time, he had barely glanced at the work she was doing. He had assumed it was temporary, something she would eventually leave behind once his own career reached its next stage. Standing in the ballroom now, Daniel felt an uncomfortable realization settle in his mind. Emily had never been following his path. She had quietly been building her own. Vanessa glanced between them, sensing the complicated history beneath their calm conversation. "It must be an incredible responsibility," she said carefully to Emily. "Running a company like Whitmore Global." Emily considered the comment for a moment before answering. "Responsibility is rarely as dramatic as people imagine," she said gently. "Most of the time it simply means showing up every day and making the right decision even when no one is watching." Her words were not directed at Daniel, yet he felt their meaning clearly. Across the ballroom, a photographer raised a camera to capture images of the evening's announcement, the flash briefly illuminating the crowd as reporters began recording the story that would appear in financial headlines the next morning. Emily glanced toward the stage where the Whitmore crest still shone behind the podium. The future Arthur Whitmore had trusted her with was no longer private. It now belonged to the entire world. And somewhere within the quiet tension of the ballroom, Daniel Brooks was beginning to realize that the woman he once believed he understood had become someone far more formidable than he had ever imagined. The low hum of conversation slowly returned to the Whitmore ballroom, but the center of gravity in the room had shifted, and nearly every discussion now seemed to orbit one quiet fact that could not be ignored. Emily Carter had just become the most powerful person in the building. The orchestra continued its gentle melody from the balcony, yet beneath the soft music there was a subtle tension moving through the crowd like a current. Investors, executives, and journalists all watched Emily with growing interest as she spoke with members of the Whitmore board near the center of the room. Daniel Brooks remained where he stood beside the marble bar, his posture still composed, but his thoughts far less steady than he wanted anyone to notice. He had spent years mastering the art of confidence, the ability to step into any room and assume control of the narrative. Tonight the narrative had shifted without asking his permission. Vanessa Hale studied him carefully before glancing back toward Emily, who now stood surrounded by several senior directors from Whitmore Global. "You seem surprised," Vanessa said quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly before answering. "I did not know she worked with Whitmore," he admitted. The words felt strange even as he said them, because the truth beneath them was far more complicated. Daniel had known Emily for more than a decade. He had lived with her, shared dinners with her, listened to her talk about financial models and investment strategies late at night while he prepared presentations for his own clients. Yet somehow the version of Emily standing across the ballroom tonight felt entirely unfamiliar. Near the center of the room, one of the Whitmore executives leaned closer to Emily and spoke with visible enthusiasm about upcoming strategic plans for the company. Emily listened carefully, nodding with calm focus before offering a thoughtful response that immediately captured the attention of the small group surrounding her. Daniel could not hear the details from across the room, but he could see the effect. These were not polite congratulations. These were the first real conversations about the future of Whitmore Global, and Emily was already guiding them. A reporter from a financial magazine approached cautiously with a notepad in hand. "Ms. Carter," the reporter asked respectfully, "do you expect major changes to Whitmore Global now that you have assumed leadership?" Emily paused for a moment before answering, her voice steady enough to carry across the nearby crowd. "Arthur Whitmore built this company on patience and long-term thinking," she said. "That principle will not change. But the world around us always does. Our responsibility is to be ready for it." Several of the executives nodded in quiet agreement. The reporter scribbled quickly, clearly satisfied with the response. Daniel watched the exchange closely. The way Emily spoke to the press was not hesitant or defensive. It was controlled, deliberate, almost effortless. She did not sound like someone who had suddenly inherited power. She sounded like someone who had been preparing for it. The realization settled slowly in Daniel's mind like the final piece of a puzzle he had never realized he was assembling. For years he had believed that ambition moved in straight lines. Promotions, partnerships, larger offices, bigger deals. Emily's path had moved differently, quietly building momentum outside the spotlight he had been chasing. Vanessa followed his gaze again toward Emily, her expression thoughtful. "She seems very comfortable with all of this," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied after a moment. "She does." Across the ballroom, Emily finished speaking with the reporter and briefly scanned the room, her eyes moving calmly across the gathered guests. For a brief moment her gaze passed over Daniel again. The look was not confrontational or emotional. It was simply observant, the calm awareness of someone who had already stepped beyond the life she once shared with him. And as the music continued and the lights of the ballroom shimmered across polished marble and crystal glasses, Daniel Brooks began to understand something that no one had explained to him before tonight. The woman he once believed had been standing quietly behind him had in fact been moving forward the entire time. The quiet momentum surrounding Emily Carter continued to grow as the evening unfolded, like a tide slowly reshaping the shoreline of the ballroom. Conversations that once centered on market trends and private deals now drifted toward a single subject. People wanted to understand the woman who had quietly stepped into one of the most powerful positions in American finance without fanfare or spectacle. Beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, Emily moved through the crowd with the calm assurance of someone who understood exactly where she stood. She listened more than she spoke, yet when she answered questions, her words carried a quiet clarity that drew attention without demanding it. Across the room, Daniel Brooks remained near the bar, though several of the investors who had been speaking with him earlier had gradually excused themselves and crossed the ballroom to introduce themselves to Emily instead. Daniel noticed each departure with polite professionalism, but inside he felt the subtle shift in influence taking place. Vanessa Hale observed the same pattern, her expression thoughtful as she watched two senior venture partners approach Emily with visible interest. "They all want to meet her now," Vanessa murmured softly. Daniel nodded once, his eyes still fixed on Emily. "Of course they do," he said quietly. "She now controls Whitmore Global." The words sounded straightforward, yet they carried a weight Daniel had not expected to feel. For years he had moved through financial circles believing that success came from visibility and bold decisions. Emily's rise had followed a different rhythm entirely. She had built something steady, something patient, something powerful enough to reveal itself only when the moment was right. Near the center of the ballroom, a group of executives had gathered around Emily as she discussed Whitmore Global's upcoming infrastructure investments. The large windows along the wall revealed the lights of Manhattan stretching across the skyline like a sea of stars, and the reflection of the city shimmered faintly against the glass behind her. One of the younger investors leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Miss Carter," he asked, "Arthur Whitmore was known for thinking decades ahead of everyone else. Do you see the company continuing that same strategy?" Emily considered the question briefly before answering. "Arthur Whitmore believed that time is the most valuable resource in business," she said. "If you build something strong enough to last 20 years, the world eventually begins to trust it. And trust is the foundation of every lasting company." The investor nodded thoughtfully, while others nearby listened with growing respect. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. The calm authority in Emily's voice reminded him of the evenings years ago when she would explain financial trends at their dining table, patiently walking through data while he skimmed the headlines and moved on to the next opportunity. At the time he had admired her intelligence, but never fully considered what it might become. Vanessa glanced toward him again. "You must be proud of her," she said lightly. Daniel looked at her for a moment before answering. "Proud is not the word I would use," he said slowly. "Impressed might be closer." Across the ballroom, Emily finished speaking with the group of investors and stepped aside for a moment, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. The room continued to buzz with renewed energy as journalists typed messages into their phones and executives quietly calculated what this change in leadership might mean for the future of Whitmore Global. Emily lifted the glass slightly and looked out over the crowd once more. Her gaze moved calmly across the room, not searching for approval, but observing the people who would now become part of the company's next chapter. For a brief second, her eyes passed over Daniel again. The moment was small, almost invisible among the shifting crowd, yet Daniel felt its quiet significance. The distance between them was no longer defined by the end of a marriage. It was defined by the different futures they had chosen to build. And as the music continued beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, Daniel Brooks began to understand that the woman he once believed he had left behind had stepped into a world he had never fully seen coming. The ballroom continued to shimmer with quiet energy as the night moved forward, but the rhythm of the evening had undeniably changed. What had begun as a formal celebration of Whitmore Global's legacy had transformed into something far more significant. Every conversation, every quiet glance across the marble floor, now circled back to the same person, Emily Carter, standing near the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Emily held her glass of sparkling water loosely in one hand as she listened to a senior infrastructure partner explain a proposal for a new logistics corridor along the eastern seaboard. Beyond the glass, the city stretched for miles, its lights glowing like a living constellation. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to take in the view. Years ago, she had stood in offices overlooking this same skyline with Arthur Whitmore as he explained how the future of an entire industry could change based on decisions made quietly in rooms just like this one. Now those decisions would belong to her. Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks watched the scene unfold with increasing clarity. The early shock of the announcement had faded, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: recognition. For years he had believed that Emily had stepped out of the world they once shared. When their marriage ended, he assumed she would eventually rebuild a quieter life somewhere beyond the competitive financial circles he was determined to dominate. Yet standing here tonight, Daniel realized that Emily had never left that world at all. She had simply chosen a path that did not depend on recognition. Vanessa Hale gently set her champagne glass down on the bar and followed Daniel's gaze toward Emily once again. "She seems very comfortable with everyone here," Vanessa observed. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is because she already knows them," he said quietly. The thought formed with unsettling clarity. These investors, these executives, these board members had not just met Emily tonight. Many of them had likely worked with her for years without the attention he once believed was necessary for success. Near the center of the ballroom, a group of journalists had gathered, waiting for an opportunity to speak with Emily again. One of them finally approached with a respectful smile. "Ms. Carter," the journalist said, holding a small recording device. "Many people are curious about your relationship with Arthur Whitmore. What made him trust you with such an enormous responsibility?" Emily paused thoughtfully before answering. The room nearby quieted slightly as people leaned closer to hear her response. "Arthur Whitmore believed that leadership begins with listening," she said calmly. "Most people in business spend their time trying to prove how much they know. He taught me that real progress begins when you take the time to understand what others are seeing." The journalist nodded, clearly intrigued by the answer, and several guests nearby exchanged impressed glances. Daniel watched the exchange with growing realization. The woman speaking now was not simply the Emily he remembered from their shared apartment years ago. She was someone who had quietly absorbed the lessons of one of the most respected financial minds in the country. The orchestra shifted into a slower piece as waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and small silver plates. The evening continued as any grand Manhattan event would, but the attention of the room remained centered on Emily Carter. Eventually, Emily stepped away from the group of reporters and moved toward the balcony doors where the cool night air slipped gently into the ballroom. She paused there for a moment, looking out across the skyline once again. For the first time that evening, the noise of the room faded behind her. Years of effort, patience, and quiet determination had led to this moment. And although the room inside buzzed with speculation and admiration, Emily knew that the real work had only just begun. Behind her, Daniel Brooks watched her silhouette against the city lights and understood something that had taken him far too long to recognize. Emily Carter had never needed to stand in his shadow. She had been building her own horizon the entire time. The cool night air drifting in from the balcony doors carried the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic far below, a quiet reminder that the city outside continued moving at its relentless pace regardless of what had just changed inside the Whitmore ballroom. Emily Carter stood for a moment near the open doors, her gaze resting on the skyline where towers of glass and steel stretched toward the dark sky, like silent witnesses to countless decisions that shaped the country's financial future. Behind her, the ballroom remained alive with conversation, but the tone had shifted from curiosity to careful attention. People were no longer simply observing the evening's announcement. They were beginning to understand the reality of it. Whitmore Global now belonged to Emily Carter. The orchestra continued its soft arrangement from the balcony, and waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with fresh glasses of champagne. The event maintained its elegant rhythm, yet beneath the music there was a new layer of focus that had not been present earlier in the evening. Daniel Brooks stepped away from the marble bar after several long minutes, adjusting his jacket as he crossed the polished floor. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as if he were approaching an important negotiation rather than a conversation with someone who had once shared his home. Vanessa remained near the bar, watching him with calm curiosity, but choosing not to follow. She understood that whatever conversation was about to happen did not involve her. Emily sensed the movement behind her before Daniel spoke. She turned slowly from the balcony doors, just as he stopped a few feet away. For a moment neither of them said anything. The lights of the city reflected faintly in the glass beside them, framing the quiet distance that had formed between their lives. Daniel finally cleared his throat, the confident tone he used in boardrooms returning to his voice. "You handled that announcement very well," he said, nodding toward the stage where the Whitmore crest still glowed above the podium. Emily regarded him calmly, the faintest hint of a smile touching her expression. "Arthur Whitmore prepared me for moments like this," she replied. Daniel studied her carefully, noticing the steady composure in her posture, the same composure he had once mistaken for quiet passivity. Now he understood that it had never been weakness at all. "You never mentioned how closely you worked with him," Daniel continued. Emily's gaze moved briefly toward the crowd behind him where executives and reporters continued their conversations. "There were many things we did not talk about during those years," she said gently. The words carried no accusation, only a simple acknowledgement of the truth. Daniel looked down for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "It seems I underestimated you," he admitted. Emily did not answer immediately. The orchestra shifted into another slow piece as laughter drifted across the room from a nearby group of investors. After a few seconds, she spoke quietly. "Most people do not notice quiet work while it is happening," she said. "They only see the results once everything is finished." Daniel nodded slightly, the meaning of her words settling deeper than he expected. For years he had measured success through visible achievements, promotions, public recognition, the approval of influential people. Emily had built something different, something patient, something that had revealed itself only when the moment arrived. Across the ballroom, several members of the Whitmore board were beginning to gather near the stage again, discussing plans for a private strategy meeting later that evening. Emily noticed them and glanced briefly back toward Daniel. "The real work begins tonight," she said calmly. "Whitmore Global has many decisions ahead." Daniel followed her gaze toward the group of executives, recognizing the seriousness of what lay in front of her. For the first time that evening, he felt something close to respect rather than surprise. Emily Carter was not simply stepping into Arthur Whitmore's legacy. She was preparing to lead it forward. And as the golden lights of the ballroom reflected across marble and crystal, Daniel Brooks understood that the woman standing before him had quietly become one of the most powerful figures in the room. Emily Carter watched the group of Whitmore executives gathering near the stage, their quiet discussion already shifting from ceremony to strategy, and she knew that the evening had crossed an invisible line. The celebration was ending. Leadership was beginning. The music from the balcony orchestra continued to flow through the ballroom like a calm river, but beneath the elegant atmosphere there was a growing focus among the people who truly understood the weight of what had just happened. Whitmore Global was not merely a company. It was a network of decisions, investments, and responsibilities that stretched across industries and continents. And now those responsibilities rested with her. Emily stepped away from the balcony doors, her posture composed as she walked back toward the center of the room. The polished marble floor reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers above, and conversations softened slightly as people noticed her passing. It was not the attention given to celebrity or spectacle. It was something quieter, something closer to professional recognition. Daniel Brooks remained where he had been standing only moments earlier, watching her move across the ballroom with a thoughtful expression that had replaced the earlier surprise on his face. For years he had believed he understood how influence moved through rooms like this one. Yet tonight he had witnessed a different kind of power entirely. Not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. Vanessa Hale noticed the shift in Daniel's expression as Emily approached the group of executives near the stage. "You are still thinking about it," Vanessa said quietly. Daniel nodded once without looking away from the scene unfolding across the room. "Yes," he replied, "because I realize now that I never truly understood who she was." Vanessa followed his gaze toward Emily, who had just joined the Whitmore board members gathered beside the podium. The lawyer who had announced the inheritance earlier was standing with them, holding a thin portfolio filled with documents that clearly marked the beginning of formal responsibilities. One of the senior directors, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, greeted Emily with a respectful handshake. "We have arranged a private conference room upstairs," the director explained calmly. "There are several matters that require your approval before the end of the week." Emily nodded thoughtfully. Then we should begin tonight, she said. The simplicity of her response carried the quiet authority of someone who had already accepted the role waiting for her. The group moved slightly aside as the lawyer opened the portfolio and began reviewing the first set of documents. Although their conversation remained professional and measured, it was clear to anyone watching that this was no symbolic transition. The leadership of Whitmore Global had already begun to shift into motion. Across the ballroom, several journalists observed the scene carefully, recognizing that the real story of the evening was not just the inheritance announcement. It was the calm efficiency with which Emily Carter had stepped into her position. Daniel leaned lightly against the marble bar again, his thoughts moving through memories he had not considered in years. He remembered evenings when Emily would quietly review financial reports while he prepared his own presentations for investors. At the time, he believed she was simply supporting his ambitions. Now he understood that she had been building knowledge and relationships that extended far beyond the life they once shared. Vanessa lifted her glass of champagne thoughtfully. You know, she said softly, most people spend years trying to reach the kind of position she just inherited. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile, though it carried a hint of humility he had rarely shown before. She did spend years reaching it, he said quietly. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter finished reviewing the documents and exchanged a final word with the Whitmore executives before turning slightly to look across the room. Her gaze passed over the gathered guests, the reporters, the investors, and finally the skyline beyond the tall windows. The future of Whitmore Global was no longer a distant plan shaped by someone else's vision. It was a responsibility she now carried herself. And in that moment, beneath the golden lights of the ballroom and the endless glow of Manhattan beyond the glass, Emily Carter understood that the next chapter of her life had already begun. The quiet strategy discussion beside the stage gradually concluded as the Whitmore executives closed their portfolios and exchanged brief nods of agreement. The orchestra continued its gentle melody above the ballroom, but the tone of the evening had shifted into something calmer and more deliberate. The announcement had been made, the responsibilities acknowledged, and now the machinery of Whitmore Global had quietly begun turning beneath the surface of the celebration. Emily Carter stepped away from the small group of executives, her posture steady as she moved back into the open space of the ballroom. The polished marble floor reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers above, and the distant skyline of Manhattan shimmered through the tall windows like a living horizon of light. Conversations resumed around her with a slightly different tone than earlier in the evening. Investors who had once spoken confidently now watched her with thoughtful respect. Journalists continued typing notes into their phones, knowing that tomorrow's financial headlines would carry her name across the country. Yet Emily herself remained calm, almost reflective, as she crossed the room. Across the ballroom, Daniel Brooks observed her again, but this time his expression carried none of the earlier confusion or disbelief. Instead, there was a quiet understanding forming behind his eyes. Vanessa Hale noticed the change immediately. You look different, she said softly. Daniel glanced toward her for a moment, before returning his attention to Emily. Perspective does that, he replied. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying him. You regret letting her go, she said. Daniel did not answer right away. The question hovered between them as the orchestra's music drifted through the air. After a moment, he spoke carefully. Regret is not always about the past, he said slowly. Sometimes it is about realizing how little you understood someone while you had the chance. Vanessa followed his gaze again toward Emily, who had paused near one of the tall windows where the city lights glowed beyond the glass. She seems very certain about what she is doing, Vanessa observed. Daniel nodded slightly. That is because she has been preparing for it longer than anyone realized. Near the windows, Emily stood quietly for a moment, looking out across the skyline. The city stretched for miles beneath the night sky, a living network of ambition, opportunity, and endless movement. Arthur Whitmore used to say that New York never truly slept because somewhere in the city someone was always building the next chapter of the future. Emily felt the truth of those words now more than ever. Behind her, the ballroom remained full of conversation, yet the noise seemed distant compared to the quiet clarity settling in her mind. Years of patient work had led her to this moment, but she knew that leadership was never defined by a single announcement. It was defined by what happened next. The tall silver-haired director from the Whitmore board approached again with a calm smile. "We will prepare the conference room upstairs," she said. "Whenever you are ready." Emily nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied. "I will join you shortly." The director stepped away, leaving Emily alone near the window once more. She turned slightly and allowed her gaze to move across the ballroom. Investors, reporters, executives, all of them part of a world she now helped shape. And somewhere among them stood Daniel Brooks, the man who once believed her life would always revolve around his ambitions. Their eyes met briefly across the room. There was no tension in the moment, only a quiet understanding that time had carried them to very different destinations. Daniel lifted his glass slightly in a small gesture of acknowledgement. Emily returned the gesture with a calm nod. It was not reconciliation, nor was it confrontation. It was simply recognition. The orchestra finished its piece as the city lights continued to shimmer beyond the glass. And in that quiet pause between music and motion, Emily Carter understood that the story people had witnessed tonight was only the beginning of the future she intended to build.